One of the fastest ways to stall a leadership conversation is to start with certainty. Now, I know that that's going to strike you a little funny, and that's probably not the word you were expecting me to use at the end of that sentence, but it's true. It's not true because the leader is wrong. In fact, oftentimes the leader is right. But when you start out with a high degree of certainty, it closes the door to better solutions. It closes that door to better solutions before the real problem is even fully understood. And the irony of that is that most leaders think they are doing the exact opposite. They think that starting with certainty is diagnosing the issue, when in reality, they're just reinforcing an assumption that they had already held. Let me say that again. Their level of certainty comes from reinforcing an assumption that they had already held. And years ago, I watched this happen in a meeting in real time, right? Where we went from the assumption to clearing up all of that certainty to get to curiosity. And it allowed us to really write. So this was years ago when I was pulled into a meeting with my boss and one of his colleagues. Just to set the stage a little bit, this was back when millennials were talked about like Gen Z is talked about now. So the thought was that millennials were just lazy and they didn't want to get into the workforce. And if they did, they just kind of wanted to hang out. They weren't going to work very hard. And the type of work that we were talking about in that meeting required people to do some hard work, some physical work and some mental work, and just be willing to kind of leave it all on the field. So the goal of that particular meeting was to figure out how we could increase our number of hires as field adjusters. And if you're not from the insurance realm and you don't know what a field adjuster is, those are the people who show up after the tornado, after the hailstorm, maybe after a flood. They're the ones that are climbing on the roofs, right? They're the ones who are walking through damaged homes and churches and businesses. They are checking on the basements after sewer backups. They are looking at the mold that's growing in the walls. This is important work. This is the type of work that is absolutely critical for you to go through one of those catastrophic losses and actually get a check in your hand that you can do something with. So it's important and it's needed, but it's messy and it's unpredictable. And sometimes it's even dangerous, right? So we came into that meeting. These two gentlemen were going to do most of the talking. They had previously been field adjusters. And I was there to take notes, to understand the action items that came from these two guys, and to really just be the workhorse, right? To get things done after that meeting. But the conversation did not go in a direction that any of us expected. So very quickly, the meeting devolved a little bit, right? We had a goal around a solution that we wanted to create. But when you're talking about a generation of people that you're assuming doesn't want to work, it doesn't start out that way. It starts out in a cycle. You have been in this conversation before, maybe even been part of this conversation before. One guy says nobody wants to work anymore. The other guy says, I know, back in our day, we wanted to work hard to support our family. We actually cared about the work that we do. And the other guy says, no, it's not that they don't care. They care. They just care about having a cushy office job where they can sit on their butts and push papers around, right? You've heard some variation of this conversation before, right? And it's funny because they come in with their own perspective and they just start building on each other. One guy says one thing and he's feeling pretty confident about it. And then the other guy says something that, escalates it a little bit. And pretty soon they're like, yeah, why doesn't everyone see it this way? Why doesn't everyone just agree with us? Because clearly now there is evidence. Maybe you've seen this in a different situation. Imagine you went with a couple of your friends to a restaurant that they love. This is their place. You've never been there before. And they start just raving it up, talking about how good the burgers are. You've never had a burger like this. It's the best burger you've ever had in your life. And you get it. And it's fine. It's not bad. But it's just a burger. But they are so sure because they've talked each other up. They have just brought this feeling up so high that they are certain that there's nothing else like it. Burgers, employees, a little bit different, but the feeling in that conversation is the same. You get on this train and you just can't get. And that's exactly what was happening in this meeting. There's two smart leaders, right? Both of them were just reinforcing what the other one had said. They were just reinforcing the same assumption that they both had. And the problem, apparently, as you would have heard them describe it, was that kids today are just too lazy. But something about that conversation just didn't sit right with me, right? Because I was in that generation. I was part of the group that they were assuming was just too lazy and didn't want to work. And so, because I had firsthand knowledge of people like me, myself included, that did want to work, I was working hard when I was in the office, I was taking my laptop home at night, I was putting in all sorts of effort to be good at my job. And yet, I mean, there was some evidence to support what they were saying, right? There weren't enough field adjusters. So maybe there was a kernel of truth. Maybe everybody my age really did just want these laptop, cushy, easy jobs that the boomers would refer to as pushing paper. Who had paper, right? But instead of getting angry, instead of pushing back and saying, nah, that's not us, I just looked at them and thought, well, both of you got out of that profession. Both of you took on the office job. And so, with legitimate curiosity, I leaned in and said, what do you think it is that makes people not want to do it? You guys are the experts in this because you didn't want to do it anymore. What is it that 10, 15 years ago made you want to leave those field adjuster roles and move into something different? All of a sudden, the energy in that conversation just completely shifted because now they were answering a different question. They weren't answering the question of why are people lazy and how do we work around these lazy people, but they were answering the question of why did we make the decision? It became internal to them and they were able to get curious with themselves. So we could stop that spiral, we could stop that runaway train by just simply asking a question that invited some reflection with no judgment. This is great. You guys have done well for yourself and you moved on from those roles. Why would you want to get out of it? And that moment, that desire to stop that runaway train, that thought that you have that just gives you 1 second guess to say, do we really want to keep going down this direction? That moment is exactly why I created something that I call the Communication Translation Guide. Because most of us have this internal reaction in meetings. Maybe it's frustration, maybe it's judgment, maybe it's I just don't see it that way. And usually we get too scared to speak up because we think we need to lean into that certainty. But it's not certainty you want, it's curiosity. The leaders who move conversations forward know how to translate that reaction into a question that opens the conversation instead of shutting it down. And if that is something that you want help with, there is a free guide linked below in the show notes that will walk you through how to turn those internal reactions into curiosity-driven questions that actually advance the discussion. So back to my meeting, right? So once they started answering the questions, the reasons came pretty quickly, right? So when you are a field adjuster, you have to jump on a flight at a moment's notice so that you can get to these areas that just went through some act of God, some flood, some tornado, some hurricane, right? And that meant that they weren't always there for their families when they wanted to be. That meant that they couldn't coach the little league team that they were always talking about coaching. And eventually they got to a time in their lives where their family said, we're not putting up with this anymore. So they moved out of that spur of the moment work into something more stable so that they would never have to miss a high school game, even though they missed the little league ones. There were travel stipends that allowed for, a bump of money every time they had to go do that kind of stuff. But a couple $100 extra wasn't actually going to make missing those moments worth it. And like I said before, this is actually kind of dangerous work. You don't think of insurance as being dangerous work, but those field adjusters who are walking on roofs after severe hail, they're climbing through damaged buildings, or they're down in these moldy, crusty basements. Now, on top of that, there was all sorts of technology that was happening, right? So they were getting new drones or new, measuring devices that was meant to make their life easier, but it meant that they had to learn something new constantly. It also meant that they had this threat in the back of their mind of how much can you replace? Is there going to be some point where you don't actually need me to do this work anymore? So it felt unsafe, unstable, and unsafe in the moment, right? Because you didn't want to be out doing all those things that were potentially going to get you sick or hurt or worse. And also unstable, unsafe for the future, because if we can automate and, have that drone fly over and actually see the hail damage, I won't be needed to go on the roof. So it went from this assumption, this certainty that kids today are lazy, but that didn't actually hold up anymore. And now it had turned into something that was more like they realized sooner what took me 15 years to figure out. It took me a long time. I missed those moments with my young family, and they aren't willing to sacrifice them. I thought a couple $100 was worth it, but they see that their time is more valuable than that money. I was afraid of what could be replacing me at any moment, and they're actually just taking preemptive steps to get ahead of it. Jeff got on board, the colleague, he got on board pretty quickly and thought, oh, well, we're going to have to just do things to make this job more attractive, to control for some of those risks, right? Or at least make that payment a bit more attractive in spite of them. Tim, my boss, love him to death, but he kind of just sat back and crossed his arms. He did not think that this was real. But to his credit, even though he thought kids today were still lazy, still looking for some cushy office job, he at least was willing to admit something that was important. And that is circling that complaint, circling that assumption, that certainty of that us versus them dynamic, those kids today aren't worth it, that wasn't helping. So even though he wasn't completely on board with where I was going and where Jeff was following me a little bit reluctantly to, Tim at least knew that moving in that direction would serve our project, serve our organization better than sitting there and just commiserating about where we were at. And this is where curiosity becomes a leadership skill, because assumptions and curiosity, they lead to different outcomes. And again, you don't have to be the front runner that's pounding the drum for curiosity and innovation. I don't care if you're me in the story. I don't care if you're Jeff. I don't care if you're Tim. But challenging that assumption to at least take a step forward, even if you are not completely certain of that new thought, is going to take you further than being certain about your assumptions ever will. But I want to spend a little bit of time here because I want to make sure that we are on the same page, right? Because certainty in your assumptions, that looks like the assumption that people are lazy, that the team doesn't care, that employees just want easy work, right? And that once that problem is framed that way, there's nothing to solve. It's just a problem. There's no way you can move forward. You are stuck exactly where you stand. Curiosity, though, it reframes the problem. So instead of asking, like, what's wrong with people, right? Why are people this way? Curiosity actually asks, what would make this decision reasonable? If it's true, if we just take for granted that they don't want to go this direction, why would that be? What would make that true? That one shift, that one change changes everything. Because now you get to ask better questions. Now you have this whole other avenue that is open to you that wasn't previously, right? So you can say, can we change the pay structure? Can the travel be scheduled further in advance? Can we make smaller territories so when they do have to travel at a moment's notice, They're only going a little ways away, and so they'll be back sooner. But none of those ideas are guaranteed solutions. We don't know for sure that any one or all of those are going to work within the organization or for the people you're trying to hire as field adjusters, but they are real options. Options that didn't exist 5 minutes ago because we weren't entertaining that there was anything else going on other than people being lazy. And again, this is why translating your internal reactions into productive questions is such a powerful leadership skill. Because most of us have that internal instinct, that switch in the back of our head that says, this doesn't feel right that we keep spiraling down. This doesn't feel right that we keep getting more and more negative and more certain of our problems. And if you don't have that instinct, but you can hear everyone, again, maybe even including yourself, just assuming that there's one issue that doesn't have a solution, then flag that in your head and know that it's totally normal that we don't know how to move that energy in a direction that keeps the conversation moving forward. Okay, so even in this video, we've talked a lot about the problem, and I want to give you some clear visual for how to think about the solution. Think about turning your problem and your certainty and your assumption into curiosity. So think about a basketball player. And even if you're not overly familiar with basketball, that will be okay. When a player catches a ball, they plant their feet, right? They might catch the ball in the air and land on both feet. And if they stay there, if they stay with both feet planted on the floor, because they don't want to travel, they haven't decided if they're going to dribble, they don't know if they're going to pass or shoot, they're just standing there. If they are frozen exactly where they've landed, they have one move, maybe two, right? But they can only move from right here. But when they pivot on the floor, on their one foot, they can scan the entire floor. They can look at the entire court. And suddenly they can see passing lanes over here. They can see, another player who's open over here or a way that they could dribble around and get a good shot. There are all sorts of different options, and they truly haven't moved their body yet. They haven't made the decision. They don't know where the right place to go is yet. But what they do know is that they can pivot and move around to give themselves more options. They have all of these different angles that didn't exist a second earlier. Curiosity is your pivot. Curiosity is your ability to see the entire court and where you can go with the ball. Assumptions are going to keep you stuck with that one vantage point, that one tunnel vision, and that one runaway train. That's your best case option when you stick in the certainty of those assumptions. But curiosity lets you turn and see new possibilities. If you take one thing away from this video, I want it to be this. Leaders who solve the biggest problems inside organizations, they aren't necessarily the ones with the fastest answers, the ones with the most certainty and resolve around what they say. They're the ones who are willing to ask the question that reframes the problem. So instead of asking, why are people like this? They ask, what would make this behavior make sense? Instead of asking, why won't they work harder? They ask, what would make this role worth choosing? Because curiosity doesn't guarantee you the right answer, but it does guarantee you something that assumptions never will: options. And options are where real solutions come from. So the next time that you feel that internal reaction in a meeting, that you feel that flip of the switch that says, this just doesn't feel right, this doesn't feel like the whole story, pause, get curious, and ask the question that helps everyone around you pivot. Because the assumptions trap you, and the curiosity, that opens the floor. All right, I hope that this was helpful for you today. Go down, click the link, and get your communication guide. It is going to help you make this transition from assumptions to curiosity so much faster. All right, I will see you in the next one.